Oh, I'm in the wrong place. Let me see if I can find. Better go back to my channel. I got some people that are, oh, let's just say out of line, disrespectful, and ignorant. And what they are is basically atheists. So let's just disprove atheism. Well, actually, atheism is pretty much dependent upon Darwinism. So let's just disprove Darwinism real quick. And Darwinism destroyed in 5 minutes. And I think that's Berlinski. And by the way, he's not a Christian. He's just a scientist. That's 37 minutes. Math and Darwinism, that's like 1 minute. Basically destroys it in 1 minute. But there's a great video. All we got to do is find it. Look at that one. Similarities are not enough for Darwinism. Evolution destroyed in under 5 minutes. And evolution is the...
It's tough to say because we're not dealing with a theory in any sense in which, say, a physicist would recognize the theory. We're dealing with a collection of anecdotes, a certain point of view, a series of hunches. I would say that the most outstanding, the salient points are, first of all, the fossil record, which is simply mystifying. We can't make much sense of the fossil record. It does not sustain any kind of Darwinian prediction that can be intelligently derived from Darwinian theory, and it doesn't seem to sustain anything else as far as I can see. It's a perfectly mystifying record. That's one obvious point. I'm not talking just about the Cambrian explosion, I'm talking about everything that doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the fossil record. Second point, we have never been able in any way theoretically to examine the central Darwinian claim that natural selection and random variation can account for a great deal of complexity. If you look at the history of physics, for example, what did Newton do in the 17th century? He said, well, the planets are being attracted to the sun by a force. It's not any kind of force, it's an inverse square force. And then he went and showed that if you make that assumption, the result will be an orbit that conforms exactly to the observed orbit, say, of the Earth or of Mars. It will be a conic section. And then he proved the converse, that if it's a conic section, the planets must be attracted to a central source by an inverse square law. There is nothing like that in biology, in Darwinian theory. A kind of canonical demonstration that this mechanism, random variation, natural selection, is adequate to the generation of this level of complexity. From the point of view of the serious sciences, without that kind of a demonstration, one is completely adrift. You have no idea whether the mechanism is adequate for its intended purposes. This is the second point. Third evidential piece of the puzzle. Look, in terms of serious sciences, in terms of general relativity or quantum mechanics, I can program a computer with the equations of general relativity, or with the equations of quantum mechanics, and I can say, all right, what are the consequences? I can actually see the consequences emerge in a simulation. We can't do any of this in biology. And that should prompt any reasonable person to ask, why not? If this is such a simple mechanism, it can easily be programmed by a computer, how come we can't set up a computer and create something of biological-like complexity? How come we cannot see the unfolding of an evolutionary process the way we can see the unfolding of an evolutionary process in physics? It's a very serious question. I've looked at all the genetic algorithms. I'm trying to write a genetic algorithm myself. And the sheer fact is, without a tremendous amount of very special manipulation and ad hoc constraints, the computer is not going to generate anything realistic if it uses Darwinian mechanisms. And it will generate something realistic only if it doesn't use Darwinian mechanisms. This is important. 50 years after the computer revolution began, we have a splendid tool for assessing the intelligibility and viability of Darwinian theory. And everything that we know, and I think this is the uniform experience of anyone working in genetic algorithms, indicates these mechanisms will not work. They will not work for their intended purposes. And finally, there's the utter absence of laboratory evidence. I mean, random variation, natural selection, we should be able to start manipulating organisms. When we look at dogs, no matter how far back we go, it's dogs. When we look at bacteria, no matter what we do, they stay bugs. They don't change in their fundamental nature. There seems to be some sort of an inherent species limitation, and we have no good explanation for this in terms of Darwinian theory. We should have far more flexibility, far more plasticity under laboratory conditions than we actually do, if Darwinian theory or anything like that were correct. What we see in nature, what we see in the laboratory, is very highly bounded variation, cyclic variation, as for example, finch beaks in the Galapagos Island. That's about all we see. Small variation. Why is that if Darwinian theory is correct? These are evidentiary points that I think need to be stressed, need to be examined openly, honestly. And they never are, of course. Never are.
So this course I'm taking with you on the soul,
let's see what else we could find here. Give me a chance to find it. Oh, the atheist delusion, religion and science. I like religion and science because this one here is a bit too long, 1 hour and 8 minutes. Here's one that's 6 minutes, has to do with the Shroud of Turin, which I find absolutely amazing. Anybody that knows anything about religion, Christianity, Christian history, history in general, would probably know about the Shroud of Turin. And the Shroud of Turin is actually the #1 most studied object on the planet Earth. That fact alone must say something. It's profound, and so this video here is really very good. I think this lady is awesome, and this video is definitely worth watching.
Scientific team regarding the shroud image. The actual image was created by a phenomenon as yet unknown, or a momentous event that caused a rapid cellulose degradation, aging, of the linen fibers. That is, an accelerated dehydration and oxidation of the very top linen fibrils of the cellulose fibers of the shroud, thereby creating a sepia or straw yellow colored image similar to that of a scorch. In other words, the image was caused by something, nobody knows what, that affected only the very top of the fibrils that make up the fibers that in turn make up the fabric.
After thousands of hours of intense study, the world was left with yet another scientific enigma. A piece of fabric that is demonstrably hand-woven containing a surface anomaly in the shape and form of a crucified man, created by some process of undetermined origin.
But how could an image containing so much information have been formed? There are those who believe the image could only have been formed by a burst of some sort of radiation. But the simple fact is, nothing like the shroud image has ever been found or reproduced. But that's only the beginning of the astounding information to be gleaned from this amazing image. In spite of skeptics and setbacks, scientists continue their search. And Dame Isabel Pitzik, a particle physicist, believes the shroud has brought science to the threshold of a whole new understanding of physics. While dealing with the position of the body within the cloth, she discovered one of those mysterious properties that cannot be, yet somehow is. An interface that divides the image transport into two hermetically separate yet simultaneous actions and forces, causing the shroud to be taut and parallel on both sides, creating a true event horizon.
In general relativity, we have found that there are certain things called black holes. Now, the surface of a black hole is called an event horizon. And it's called that because right at that surface, the laws of physics seem to change character drastically.
When you look at the image of the shroud, the two bodies next to each other, you feel that it's a flat image. But if you create, for instance, a three-dimensional object, as I did, the real body, then you realize that there is a strange dividing element, an interface, from which the image is projected up and the image is projected down. The muscles of the body are absolutely not crushed against the stone of the tomb. They are perfect. It means that the body is hovering between the two sides of the shroud. What does that mean? That there is absolutely no gravity. Other strange things you discover that the image is absolutely undistorted. Now if you imagine that the cloth was wrinkled, tight, wrapped around the body, and all of a sudden you see a perfect image which is impossible unless the shroud was made absolutely taut, rigidly taut. Everybody thinks that the tomb signifies death. Not at all, the exact opposite. The shroud and the tomb signifies an unbelievable beginning, because in the depth of the collapsed event horizon, there is something which science knows as singularity. This is exactly what started the universe in the Big Bang. We have nothing less in the tomb of Christ than the beginning of a new universe.
For centuries, the shroud has been viewed and analyzed as a record of a death, the end of the physical being. But Isabel Pitzik is suggesting that it is, in fact, just the opposite, a record not of an ending, but a beginning, which would suggest resurrection in its truest sense. And according to Dame Pitzik, this is the starting base for the new physics. But is Isabel Pitzik out on a limb with physics, where no one else wants to go? Perhaps not. Recently, a group of scientists trying to identify those things that are fundamental to the way nature works made some startling discoveries. Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, founder of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, author and lecturer, explains.
The classical traditional model in physics, which began in Newtonian times, describes how particles and atoms and molecules move and recombine. Even most of the 20th century, physicists only looked at the particle aspect of it and did not really concentrate very much on the informational aspect. And it's only really with the quantum hologram that we have brought information up to a par of importance with energy itself and with physicality, so that we understand that the universe we live in not only exists because of its physicality, but it's understood because of its information. And this is a powerful new concept. And all physical bodies have such a holographic emission that is available non-locally, which means throughout the universe, non-locally at all times.
Could it be the event horizon demonstrated by the image of the shroud sent information instantaneously throughout the universe? And does this mean that the resurrection was a universal event?
Physics has achieved a lot of success, and we think that we have pretty much everything, but it turns out we know we don't. We know there are missing links. We know there are puzzles and infinities cropping up all the time. And believe me, people are working to find some answers. But in spite of our successes, there are still some mysteries abounding.
The center star of Orion's belt is called Alnilam.
Orion's belt is also mentioned in the Bible. It's called the Belt of Orion. Let's see if we can find one more short video. The Atheist Delusion. Let's see what's in there. William Lane Craig destroys Richard Dawkins in 5 minutes. Yes, William Lane Craig is probably the number one apologist that most atheists are afraid to debate, because I don't think he's ever lost a debate. Dawkins actually was dodging William Lane Craig for quite a while until I believe he did finally, he probably took enough criticism to where he said, okay, well, I'll have to face him. But William Lane Craig, I love his arguments. There's actually no debating without a whole bunch of semantics. He's really down to earth, easy to understand, and actually just absolutely brilliant. I believe he's written like 27 books. He's a professor and a in-demand speaker. He could probably make a living just going around speaking. Anyway, so here he is, William Lane Craig destroys Richard Dawkins, and it's probably more of a comedy than anything else.
On pages 157 to 58 of his book, The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins outlines or summarizes what he calls the central argument of my book. And when you look at this argument, the conclusion of which is, therefore, God almost certainly does not exist, it is a patently, logically invalid argument. Even if you grant all 6 steps in the argument, the conclusion that God does not exist doesn't even follow logically from the argument. So it's on its face, it's logically invalid. But when you look at the argument more closely, I think it has a number of premises in it that are false. What are these premises? Well, Dawkins says that you cannot infer a designer of the universe based on the complexity in the universe, because this raises a further question, namely, who designed the designer? And that therefore this leaves biological complexity unexplained. Now, this argument on Dawkins' part, I think, is quite inept, because philosophers of science recognize that in order to recognize an explanation as the best explanation, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. In order to recognize that an explanation is the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. Let me give you an example. Suppose archaeologists digging in the earth were to come across artifacts looking like arrowheads and pottery shards and tomahawk heads. It would obviously be justifiable to infer that these artifacts were the products of some lost tribe of people, even if the archaeologists had no idea whatsoever who these people were or how they came to be there. Similarly, if astronauts were to discover a pile of machinery on the backside of the moon, they would be justified in inferring that these were the products of intelligent design, even if they had no idea whatsoever where this machinery came from or who put it there. You don't have to have an explanation of the explanation in order to recognize that an explanation is the best. And similarly, in the case of biological complexity, in order to recognize that intelligent design is the best explanation of biological complexity, you don't need to be able to explain the designer. That can be left an open question for future inquiry. So the argument is inept right from the beginning. In fact, when you think about it, if in order to recognize an explanation is the best, you have to have an explanation of the explanation, that leads immediately to an infinite regress. You need to have an explanation of the explanation of the explanation, and so on to infinity. You would never have an explanation of anything, which would destroy science. So that Dawkins' principle, if adopted, would actually be completely destructive of science. That's how inept this argument is. So that argument doesn't work. Now, Dawkins goes on to defend the idea that a designer wouldn't be a good explanation because he says the hypothesis of a divine designer is more complex than the world that you're trying to explain. An explanation has to be simpler than the phenomenon you're trying to explain, and he thinks a divine designer is less simple than the world, the universe involving all this complexity. Well, that is completely mistaken. When you reflect on the idea that God is an immaterial entity, a spirit, he is a mind without a body, then God is a remarkably simple entity because he has no parts. There's no composition in God's being. An unembodied mind is an entity that is startlingly simple in its nature. So what Dawkins is obviously confused is a mind's ideas, which may be very complex, with a mind itself, which is a very simple entity. So insofar as you're interested in simplicity, the hypothesis of a divine designer is certainly an advance in simplicity, for what it's worth, over the unexplained, contingent complexity of the universe with all its diversity and variations. So I think that Dawkins' central argument is just hopeless. It is logically invalid on the face of it, and moreover, it's predicated upon premises that I think are clearly false.
False premises. In other words, based on lies. And so, yeah, we don't have a whole lot of time for going over everything. I tried to put a few short videos, 5-6 minute videos in there. And, but as you can see, there's very much evidence for God, scientific evidence. Science always proves, as time goes on, the proof of the Bible. More and more, it was in my lifetime, they didn't believe Jericho existed, and they found it. They didn't believe that Sodom and Gomorrah existed. They found it. So, you know, archaeologists have just recently, I mean, proved, and it happens over and over and over again. Noah's flood, the whole thing. Science has always proven the Bible. And just from that one point of view, from the scientific point of view, we can see that the evidence is completely outweighs creation, completely outweighs evolution. Evolution is actually mathematically impossible. It's not only improbable. See, if you were to do the math and you come up with a certain percentage, you would say, well, this is improbable. But then you take it one step further and it becomes actually impossible. And evolution, and by the way, mathematics is the bottom line science. Bottom line. You prove everything by mathematics. And the math proves, with it beyond a shadow of the doubt, that evolution is impossible. Impossible. It's not even a discussion. So this idea of creation versus evolution is a defunct idea, and it's the only two choices you have are creation or evolution. Evolution being destroyed only leaves creation. So there's no argument. Anybody that's intellectually honest would come to that conclusion. The question would be, at that point, what are you going to do about it? But that's for another video. Actually, and I have done those videos, but I won't refer you to myself at this point. So thank you very much for watching. Brother Ed in Arkansas, over and out.